So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Kresser with the Kresser Institute and chriskresser.com. Chris, we've been going back and forth for years. We still have yet to meet personally face to face, but I remember seeing your work on preconception years ago. I think I only had my second kid at the time. So, I mean, it's when did you first start on that?
Yeah, that's actually very shortly after I graduated from school. So my wife and I were trying to conceive, and we were having some difficulty, as many people can relate to. And so me being the research geek that I am, I did a deep dive into the scientific literature, also just considered, the anthropological literature and the ancestral perspective, and started to think about what the difficulties we were having from all of those different perspectives. And eventually what I discovered ended up leading to us conceiving and then my wife eventually delivering a healthy baby, Sylvie, who is now almost 6. And I realized that what I had learned in that process was really important, and there was not really out there. We certainly didn't get that kind of information from the people we were talking to at that time. And I was already predisposed. We worked with a midwife, we had a home birth, and so we weren't necessarily going through the conventional channels. But even in that kind of alternative world, there wasn't a lot of information about how to approach difficulties conceiving from a more holistic perspective. So I taught a seminar locally here in Berkeley, like a live in-person seminar, and it was really well attended and the feedback was great. So then I decided to, take all of that curriculum and put it into an online course so that people could access it who weren't in, my local area. And that was called the Healthy Baby Code. And that was actually the first digital program that I ever created. So I think that was at least 7 years ago now.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. And, and you're absolutely right, because if you have difficulty, well, first of all, thanks for sharing that. I mean, that's a really personal experience, right? I think it's important for people to understand that we all face health issues, and a lot of us face these health issues, and that's part of why we got into this.
Absolutely. Yeah. I did not, I wasn't one of those kids that was like, oh, I want to be a doctor or a health professional when I grew up. That didn't even really enter my mind, or maybe it did at one point. I don't remember, but I definitely got here for the reason that, for my own health struggles. And then, in particular, this focus on fertility and pre and postnatal care through my own, my wife's experience and my experience becoming a parent. So right. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. And, I'm at Bastyr University right now, and I was just walking around campus with my wife, and big, beautiful trees and gardens everywhere. And wrapped all around the tall trees around here is a piece of plastic that says, fight Parkinson's now. And I'm thinking, that is a really not a good message, because we think about fighting problems like fighting fertility, or
right.
That's a problem that we have to fight.
Yeah.
Instead of the body is responding in a certain way to protect the woman from getting pregnant.
Right.
And we are labeling it as a problem instead of, okay, well, the body is facilitating this, so how can we nurture the woman and the husband, the man and woman have a healthy baby?
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I talk a lot about the importance of an evolutionary perspective. And I think this is a really good example of where that comes into play. If you understand, evolution and evolutionary principles, you will, it becomes clear that that a woman's body is only going to conceive when the environment is perceived to be safe, both the internal environment and the external environment.
Yep.
And if a woman, if there's a lot going on in the body, and in the body's wisdom, it determines that it's not an appropriate time for conception, then as you said, that's actually a protective mechanism or protective response. And we often like to think that the mind, that our sort of rational cognitive mind is making all the decisions. But the truth is that the body has an inherent cellular wisdom that's much deeper and more sophisticated in many ways when it comes to just, health, our own health, that thankfully is more powerful and often does run the show when it comes to some of these natural processes. But the problem starts, of course, when, and this is understandable, if a woman's approaching a certain age and is nervous about not being able to conceive and wants to do that, that's totally understandable. That was where my wife was and where we were. So I get that. But if we then use assisted reproductive technology to kind of override the body's natural wisdom and protective mechanism, it may work, but it's often what results in, frequent miscarriages, or perhaps the baby being born prematurely or being born with a condition, some kind of health condition, because the terrain, or, if we use like a gardening analogy, the soil was not in the place that it needed to be to nurture and grow a healthy baby. So that's really what the health, the Healthy Baby Code and all of the nutritional thinking recommendations that went into that are designed to address, because it's kind of like, before you can really, I wanted to encourage women to think about preconception, right. And I know you talk about that a lot too. It's like, what can we do to plant the seeds and prepare the terrain to be a healthy environment for a baby? And once you do that, I found that even without reproductive technology, pregnancy just happens. I mean, let's face it, the body, like, we've been doing this for a really long time, even before we were human beings, our ancestors, we've been, getting pregnant and delivering babies. The body knows how to do that when the conditions are right. So it's just a question of making the conditions right.
Yeah. And back then they had real food, and I mean, they had environmental insults of weather and infections. We have environmental insults that are, we have that control, and we have controlled environment. We have medications to boon and also hinder. Right. We also have now not healthy food. And so it's a huge issue. And then all the stresses. So another big thing that I see too with pregnancies and pregnancies that were supported using medical techniques, or even high dose supplementation to force pregnancy to term. And, as a father of 3 boys, I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. I'm just saying that we need to be aware of it and understand the potential consequences, because what happens to these unborn, or to these children who are born to men and women who did undergo all these techniques? How are their genes? How is their terrain? Right. And they're put into an environment right away that can be quite hostile. And then what are we faced with? What are we seeing on the rise so fast? Yeah, that's really tricky, because I don't need to tell you this, but epigenetics tells us now that these effects, can be passed down to our children and even their children. And that we, decisions that our parents and grandparents made before we were even a twinkle in our parents' eye are actually affecting our health span today. Right. Which is, it's kind of heavy when you think about it. It's pretty, that has profound implications. But as a parent myself, and someone who works with a lot of, current parents and future parents, for me, what that does is it just really brings into focus the importance of everything that we're talking about, like making good choices around diet and lifestyle. Doesn't just affect you as a person, it affects your kids and even their kids. So that's personally something that just continues to motivate me as an individual and as a healthcare provider. And, thinking also just about, the flip side of that, the good news of that is that our gene expression is always changing in real time. Right. So, the bad news is that choices our parents and grandparents made affect our genes, but the good news is that choices that we make now can also affect our genes and our kids and grandkids' genes. And so one of my pet peeves about the conventional approach to this topic is even the word or the diagnosis, infertility. That's a really heavy term to throw around, and it gets thrown around a lot with women. I've had women come to me in tears, like having been diagnosed with infertility, and they have this idea now that they're infertile, like they can't conceive. And that's
a really, I think, misleading term. I mean, certainly there are cases where women have structural abnormalities that actually prevent conception, and they are legitimately infertile. But in the vast majority of cases I found, and I imagine your experience has been the same, Ben, women who've been deemed to be infertile, once the conditions are then made right, they magically become fertile again.
Right.
So we need to move away from this idea of like infertility being some kind of permanent state that's unchangeable, and more toward the idea of the choices that we make in terms of our diet, our lifestyle, our behavior, the environmental exposures that we have, constantly affecting gene expression in real time in such a way that someone who was previously unable to conceive or carry a baby through to full term could be able to do that without any intervention from, assisted reproductive technology.
Fantastic point. And, if you try to plant a seed in an arid landscape with high winds, that's in your backyard, and your neighbor has big, blooming, beautiful veggies, then, you can nurture that soil too. I mean, if you and your neighbor have the same backyard plot, essentially, but your neighbor's succeeding and you're not, that's just a fertile soil problem. So they're very powerful. I am infertile. That's strong.
That's strong. And what we know too is that stress is a major, major factor when it comes to conception and fertility. And this is why I'm sure everyone knows someone who's had this experience, people who've been trying and they haven't been successful, and then they just give up and, throw up their hands and go on vacation, and then the woman gets pregnant, So, I mean, I have so many patients that's happened to, and that's a clear indicator that stress is a major contributing factor. So of course, if a woman has the idea that she's infertile, that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm really careful about not using that term. I don't think it's a helpful term. I don't think it leads to anything positive. And just keeping an open mind. And I just want to emphasize one thing too. I'm not against assisted reproductive technology. I think it can be a really useful tool. But what I would argue is that using ART without preparing the soil is rarely a good idea, and can often lead to some undesirable consequences. Like you mentioned, if you go back to your garden analogy, if you have like arid, totally unproductive soil that's not healthy, you could probably go to the garden store and get some fertilizer and other stuff that will force something to grow there. But will it be as healthy and vibrant of a plant as it would have been if the soil were adequately prepared from the start? And so that's, what my argument or what I advocate when women come to me is let's spend some time creating the right conditions. And once we've done that, if pregnancy is still not happening naturally, then maybe ART can be skillful means in that situation. But the outcome will be better no matter what when the conditions are right, whether the woman's able to get pregnant on her own without it, or whether she ends up using ART. The outcome's going to be way better because the conditions were, that preparation work was done. Yeah,
great point. And then think about too the plants that are grown. I mean, industrial agriculture is ART.
Right.
And so if you look at those, like Food Inc., that was a really scary documentary to watch.
Mm-hmm.
But we all know from research and tasting these foods that the nutritional content of organically grown food versus forced grown industrial food is greatly different.
Yeah.
And so the nutritional content of the infant, of the unborn child, is also going to be greatly depleted.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I think you could just keep going on and on with that example.
Yeah.
There's another point that I want to bring home, but I can't remember what it was, but that's a start. And I also mentioned that I thought I was infertile because I was under tremendous amounts of stress. I grew up on a ranch, and we had crop dusters flying over our home.
Right.
And we would have trees dying, and they're spraying hundreds of acres of fields right across the street from my parents' 100-acre ranch.
Right.
So I was like, man, I'm going to be pretty infertile, and but what happened was, I mean, I improved my terrain. I
Mm-hmm.
started sauning and improving my nutrition, but I also had tremendous amounts of stress. And all three of my boys, every single one, conceived on vacation.
Right.
All of them.
Yep, that's powerful. I mean, I'm just coming back from vacation myself, and I did a full digital detox where I didn't have any access to technology, no phone, no computer, no email, nothing. And I think we forget that that's how humans spent, 99.9%, 0.99% of our evolutionary history. That's how we spent, that's how we lived, pretty
Mhm.
much from day to day. And our lives on vacation now are probably a lot more similar to what our lives were like as hunter gatherers. We worked for a few hours a day, but then we had ample time for leisure and for, physical activity and celebration and dance and art and, music and also social connection. That was always a big part of our experience. And I think today, in this kind of crazy, hectic, fast-paced world that we live in, and also this technology addicted world, which I think is probably the most is an epidemic that is rarely acknowledged, and it's totally socially acceptable. um, I think these kinds of things do affect our ability to conceive a child and the development of the child in utero. They're not really on the radar for many people, and I don't see a lot of discussion about it. But I think those, we talk a lot about nutrition, of course, and the importance of that, but I think there are these other non-nutritional factors that are super important as well.
So I'm the MT Jafar guy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's my label. And we start looking at diagrams like this and all the genetics and all the,
Right. Right.
we started ordering genetic reports and 23andMe's, and we finally had MT Jafar, and that's like the holy grail SNP. And then we bombarded with methylfolate, and you know what? I feel horrible. I feel worse than I did before. And that's the gene which is contributing to all my miscarriages and infertilities and so on. And so you figure out that you got one copy of 1298C, and you put
Right.
all your hedges on that.
Right.
And that was me. It's 2012, and probably guiltily 2013 as well. And because when I read about the research on it, I was like, wow, this is really, really important. And
Yeah.
it is. But when you start looking at MTHFR and what it does, and if we eat leafy green vegetables, it's not really an issue anymore. But genetics now is taking infertility and, as you say, art, assisted reproductive technologies and so on, to assist us through pregnancy complications or infertility. We're missing the issue because, as you mentioned earlier, women have been getting pregnant for a long time.
Yeah.
And genetic polymorphism has been around for a long time.
Yes. Yes.
Only now are we able to test for them.
Yeah.
So now we're getting the results back and saying, oh, I have this SNP, I can't get pregnant. Well,
Right.
I'll tell you right now that there was a study that looked at Italians, and they have a high prevalence of MTHFR that is pretty significant. They don't have folic acid in their food, at least they didn't.
Right.
They have I shouldn't say low stress, but God, come on, you live in Italy.
Right.
And,
comparatively low. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, comparatively low. Family's important. Leafy green vegetables are important.
Mm-hmm.
And, the stress level is reduced. They didn't have children with neural tube defects.
Right.
And they didn't have any of this assisted pregnancy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, nowadays we put all this blame into genes, but the fundamentals are so critically important. And my conference just ended at ShyCon, and we kept reinforcing that fact. And there was a woman that walked away, and she posted on my Facebook last evening. She goes, I walked away with two key things to remember. One, I was asking the wrong questions,
mm-hmm.
and it led me down the wrong path. Second, I always poo-pooed the fact about the fundamentals: lifestyle, diet, sleep, mindset, environment, and so on, and breathing. She goes, I had no idea how significant those were with gene expression.
Yeah.
So share your thoughts about the fundamentals, because I know a lot of people hear that about stress
mm-hmm.
and sleep and chewing, and like,
yeah.
That's not powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a cultural disease, actually.
Mm.
I think, our medical model evolved at a time when acute infectious disease was the primary threat to our lives. In
Right.
1900, the top three causes of death were all acute infectious disease. Fast forward to today, the 8 out of 10 top causes of death are all chronic disease.
Right.
So the consequence is that we have a model medical model that's totally out of step with our current needs. And it was designed, like the idea was single drug, single disease, single treatment, single doctor, and that's it, you're done. And now that's just hopelessly inadequate. And because what we know is that all of the modern diseases that are those top 8 out of 10 causes of death, they're all lifestyle diseases. Mm-hmm. They're all diseases of a mismatch between our modern environment and our genes and our biology. We evolved to survive and thrive in a particular environment, like every other type of organism in nature, from down to the simplest single-celled organism to the most complex multicellular organism. And when that environment changes faster than our genes, our genome or epigenome can adapt, that's when this mismatch occurs. And this mismatch is the fundamental cause of all chronic modern disease. And so I don't think you can get more vivid than that in terms of, we look at the genes of our ancestors, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, they didn't get these diseases. And it wasn't just because they didn't live long enough to get them. There have been studies of modern hunter-gatherer cultures that have some access to rudimentary medical care. And when they're able to escape the, things like acute trauma or death from violence or warfare or high rates of infant mortality because of their lack of medical care, they live lifespans that are equivalent to our own in the Western world. But the difference is they reach those ages without acquiring diabetes or heart disease or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or 3 different autoimmune diseases. They actually live a really healthy life and die of natural causes. And so that proves, because their genome is basically 90% the same as ours, that proves that genes can't be the cause of this modern disease epidemic, and that almost exclusively, I think I've seen papers even published by the CDC recently that suggest that 85% or more of the causes of disease are environmental.
Yeah.
So that it's as simple as that. It's if you're, unless you've got cystic fibrosis or some, exclusively genetically determined disease, where if you have that gene, you're going to have that disease no matter what you eat or do. The choices that you make in terms of what you eat, how much you sleep, what kind of physical activity you do, how you manage your stress, what kind of chemicals you're exposed to, what kind of water you drink and air you breathe. All of these choices are basically what are going to determine how those genes that you have express, and therefore whether you're going to be sick or well. And I mean, I think the last point I would make around that is, it's not to say that genes aren't important. We do. I have a formula that I've sort of conceptualized in my mind that's very simple. It's modern disease, or put a different way, genetic predisposition plus environment equals modern disease. So what that means is that—
Say that again.
Genetic predisposition plus modern environment equals modern disease.
And so, define environment, because that's, people hear that, but they don't really understand it.
Right. So I would actually use a more recent term called the exposome in that sentence, but so few people are familiar with that. So I said environment, but since we're going to get technical, let's say genetic predisposition plus exposome equals modern disease. And the exposome refers to the sum of all non-genetic exposures that an individual encounters from the moment of their conception to the moment of their death. So we're talking about any non-genetic exposure. So that means diet. That means the place that we live, whether we live in an urban or a rural environment, and what kind of, what we're exposed to for that reason. It means the water we drink. It means the air that we breathe. It means our social environment. Do we live in a densely populated urban environment with a lot of crime and, in a kind of oppressive social structure? Do we live under a dictatorship? Do we live in a progressive social democracy? Do we live in a isolated nuclear family arrangement with just two parents and a kid? Or do we live in a more tribal, multi-generational family structure like humans did for so long? Are we, what kind of chemicals are we exposed to? Do we use natural cleaning products in the home? And do we use natural personal care products? Are we putting a lot of chemicals on our skin and breathing a lot of chemicals because of the products that we use in our home? Do we have mercury dental amalgams, or do we have, composite dental amalgams? I mean, it's vast. It's almost incomprehensible to consider all of these influences.
Let me run this by.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked the same question at a conference, what is environment? Because I kept saying environment too. And then I realized, man, I probably should back up. And so I asked the attendees and said, and they were throwing off everything, all those things. And it's absolutely correct. And this one lady goes, the environment is anything that's not us. What do you think of that?
I think it's a good description, but, and it might be useful as a simple way of talking about it. The exposome, there are actually different categories of the exposome. There's the external exposome, and then there's the internal exposome. Mm-hmm. So everything that is not us would actually be part of that external exposome. The internal exposome contains the microbiome,
right?
And which technically is not us because it's outside of the body.
Right.
Yeah. And I think you and I would both agree that has a profound impact. The microbiome, the metabolome, the estrobolome, which is the interaction between the microbiome and estrogen and other hormones, the transcriptome, like all of that stuff is super important. So I think with that caveat, I like that description.
Yeah, because that was immediately brought up. And so, what about the microbiome? Mm-hmm. Oh boy.
Yeah. But so I wanted to say, like, the genes are still important, and I think genes. I was having this conversation with someone else this morning. Genes determine what we're predisposed to, and so they can determine our overall likelihood of becoming sick, and as we're exposed to this modern exposome or lifestyle environment. We all know those people who just do everything wrong. They eat a crappy diet, they drink or smoke a lot, and they appear to be healthy. So perhaps in those cases they've just got really strong genes. So genes can determine our susceptibility overall, but I think they also then determine the particular way that disease manifests in a given individual. So if we take 10 different people, they're all exposed to the modern lifestyle, they're not all going to develop the same condition. One person might have rheumatoid arthritis, another might have Alzheimer's, another might have Hashimoto's, etc. So that's the influence of genes. But the key thing to understand is without that modern environment or exposome interaction, none of them are likely to develop those chronic diseases.
Correct. And then, so genetic, would you call it genetic predisposition? Plus the exposome equals
modern disease.
Now, a lot of people also don't understand gene expression. They think that the genes are, you're born with them.
Right.
And they're hearing all this, but they don't understand that gene expression is fast. Mm-hmm. And how fast it is. So, if I say the word lemon, right, you automatically get some mucus in your mouth and saliva, or at least hopefully you do. The opposite can happen where you get really, really stressed out. You step on the podium like I did the first time I ever did public speaking. My hand was shaking and my mouth was absolutely dry. So I went to pick up the cup and I was like this. It's those immediate situations are expressing your genes. So I think we need to understand, or you see someone and make your heart flutter. That's gene expression.
Yep. Super important point. Yeah. And because I think we all get stuck in this idea that, this might seem a little bit out there. Even the concept of me as a static individual that doesn't change. I mean, the cells that comprise me as an individual are changing and turning over every 3 to 5 days. So I'm essentially being reinvented on a continual basis. And the good news behind that is, as you're saying, those genes are expressing in real time, moment to moment to moment. So the decisions that we make, we can basically reinvent ourselves from a cellular level up by changing the decisions that we make about our diet and lifestyle and behavior.
Yeah, I think it was Sachin Patel brought up the point, like, your path to health begins with your next bite.
That's a great way.
You know, it's your next action, your immediate next action contributes to your health. And, you know, if we have this bucket, if we're trying to conceive, or if we're labeled as infertile, or, you know, we're sick and we want to have kids, but we're worried about having kids because we're so ill, your next action and the compound effect of the following action is additive and cumulative. And while you might not see gains, you are gaining.
Yeah. So I agree. Yeah. And I think I would extend this even further beyond infertile. I mean, I work with a lot of patients with chronic illness, and I really encourage people to let go of labels to the extent that it's possible. Because I think in the same way that having the idea that you're infertile really carries a whole story behind it that has effects on how you relate to yourself, how you relate to the world, and
your spouse.
Your spouse, and implications about whether you will be able to conceive, of course. But you know, that can be true for almost any other kind of disease label as well. And the truth is, there's a lot more uncertainty about these conditions than a lot of times doctors will let on. And at the end of the day, most disease conditions were just made up by somebody. You know, they were defined using a certain set of criteria that I'm not saying they're invalid. I'm just saying, does taking on that label really help you to live with the condition and to progress through it? Or is it something that becomes an obstacle? So it's a good question.
Yeah, it's the second you are labeled with anything, and that label could be wrong. I mean, how many times have you had a patient come in and say, you know, Chris, look, I've got fibromyalgia.
Right.
And then you dig deeper and you're like, no, you don't. No, you don't. You have this. Actually, you won't label them, right?
Right.
You will say that there's apparent dysfunction here.
Yeah, here. Exactly. We can describe what we see, like just as like a video camera could see. Okay, well, your muscles hurt and you've got some digestive issues, and you know, and if you need a word just to quickly tell someone who, you know, what you're going through, so they have an idea, that's fine. I'm fine with that. But what happens if we let go of that concept and you see yourself as a fundamentally healthy, you know, vital person that has some processes happening that are affecting your health? And that, to me, that's a more liberating concept, because it opens the possibility that with changes that you make, you can not have that condition. You know, I know a lot, this is a very real thing. Like a lot of, you know, with going back to my experience with my wife, like when in that initial investigation, when we found out we're looking into what was going on, I measured her, I did some testing, and we found that she had TSI antibodies, which are indicative of Graves' disease. But with some, you know, I'm an herbalist by training, acupuncturist and herbalist. And so I put her on some herbs, and we switched her diet, found that she was gluten intolerant, probably celiac. So she went on a strict gluten-free diet, and also, you know, glutathione and other immune regulatory substances, and never had those problems again, has never had positive TSI antibodies, has never had elevated T3 or T4 hormones, and has never just taken on this idea that she has Graves' disease. And so it's just, she's gone and just lived a totally normal, healthy life without any concept that she has Graves. Whereas if she would have been in the medical system, she would have been stuck with that diagnosis. She probably would have been put on PTU or methimazole or one of these very thyrotoxic drugs. which then probably would have caused other side effects that she would have needed to take other drugs for. And then she might get on some like Graves' disease support groups and start talking about,
Dr. Google.
Graves' disease and how it affects, and again, I'm not, that it can be helpful to find support and other people who are dealing with your issue. But I hope this is clear, like the different possibilities when you don't necessarily take on something like that, when, especially when it's not valid.
Right. You have to ask the right questions.
Right.
And be in a community that doesn't put their entire paradigm in a box.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If your doctor is saying you have Hashimoto's, that should be a warning sign, or you have X and you need to do this, or take this for that. Anything that reductionist, that should be screaming alarm bells.
Mm-hmm.
This very well. Patient can come in with depression, and it can be, all your patients be depressed, but every single way that you support them through that, then it's different across the board.
Yeah.
So let's move towards, walk me through how you would support a patient who is labeled as infertile. What would you, just keeping it general?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at their diet and lifestyle. I think that's, even before I get into all the hardcore functional medicine testing, which I do with patients. To me, that's actually a waste of money and time if you haven't even addressed the basics yet. And so, every patient who comes to see me, including fertility patients, fill out a very detailed new patient intake form, which includes a detailed diet survey, a sample of a couple of days of their diet. We look at their exercise and physical activity, their sleep, their stress management, their social support. I have a lot of open-ended questions on my form, like what do you believe has contributed to your health complaint? Do you believe it's possible to get well? How committed are you to getting well? What obstacles do you see that might be standing in the way of getting well? And these questions are very revealing often in terms of where the patient is. And so we do all of that before I even think about a blood test or a stool test or anything like that. If the patient is already pretty dialed in and with a lot of those things, then the next step for me will be identifying any underlying pathological mechanisms that could be contributing to their inability to conceive. So we might, I generally start with the gut, with the HPA axis, stress and stress-related pathology, and also with nutrient balance, blood sugar regulation, and basic hormones like thyroid hormones. So we'll look at all those systems. And then if all of that is good, we usually find stuff there, and then we address it. If they're still having trouble, we go to the next level. The next level is typically, more advanced stuff like heavy metal toxicity, chronic infections like Lyme or tick-borne illness or viral infection, mold or mold-related illness. We look at methylation and nutrigenomics. We look at mitochondrial function and some of these things that are less common, but can be major factors, especially in people who've already dealt with those first two levels of care. And then we just kind of go from there. To be honest, I think the biggest lever for intervention still has remained diet and lifestyle. I've had success for sure with the functional medicine stuff and testing in cases where the diet and lifestyle was already wired. But even in some of those cases, even when someone's doing a pretty good job, just little tweaks actually that you wouldn't think would be very significant can actually make the difference.
And that's when you said that we don't think they're very significant.
Mm-hmm.
Like chewing. Really?
Right.
But, and we're taught in PE and health class about the food pyramid.
Right.
And that's pretty much the extent of it. And then we ask our friends and neighbors and our parents of what to eat. And I had no idea. If I had known what I know now while I was a rower at University of Washington, I would have been such a superior athlete.
Right.
And I was just eating a bunch of garbage.
Right.
And
probably carb loading.
Yeah. Carb loading all the time.
Yeah.
That was, you got a carb load. All right. Well, then
pre-competition, you're out at like the Olive Garden eating like big things of pasta and breadsticks and stuff.
Olive Garden, yeah. As a college student, I was having pasta and pancakes,
right,
and oatmeal.
yeah, exactly.
That was my
yeah. I mean, I was a competitive basketball player in high school, and we literally, when we go on trips and we play games, we would go out to some like carb heavy restaurant before the game. I can't believe I was even able to function.
Right. I mean, you talk about mitochondrial uncoupling. My goodness.
Right.
So do you use do you use tracking devices? Do you use apps or things like the Oura Ring, or do you use those things in your clinic with patients, and how do you find them?
Sometimes. I don't think there's really any really solid at-home sleep tracker yet. There's some they're tracking movement and sleep, which is certainly one factor that can determine sleep quality, but it's possible to be sleeping poorly without moving that much, and it's possible to move around and still be sleeping okay. So they're not perfect. Generally, I find most people have a pretty good idea when they're not sleeping well. They're not waking refreshed and they're aware of tossing and turning, but I think they can be helpful. We're looking into pulse oximetry, where you have a little thing you put on your finger and around your wrist, and it measures oxygen saturation and pulse rate. And if your oxygen saturation drops and your pulse rate goes up, it suggests you're hypoxic and you've got maybe some kind of apnea. And it's a pretty easy test that can be done at home, and I think fairly accurate in terms of determining that, and it's not as expensive or as much of a hassle as a sleep study in a lab. I know that there are now some at-home apnea tests that are maybe a little bit more accurate. But I think the trackers can be used as a way of raising awareness, basically. And for someone who's not already pretty tuned in. I mean, for myself, I don't use like a Fitbit, because I found that after using one for a week or two, I could predict my number of steps without even looking at it within 200 steps. But if someone is really new to this stuff and they don't already have that level of awareness, I think it can be really great. And I would say the same thing for sleep. I think we're about to do a trial with a new startup company that has developed software that uses, you wear a heart rate variability monitor and you wear a 24-hour continuous glucose monitor. And then it uses your blood sugar level and your HRV response to help identify food intolerances, which is really interesting. And also, other environmental insults or reactions that might affect your heart rate variability and your blood sugar level in real time. So I think there's some pretty exciting, interesting developments in this area.
For sure. Alessandro Ferretti had a patient who was an elite athlete, and they had no idea that they were overtraining. So women who have received the label of infertility, are you seeing overtraining as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, particularly women who are athletes or who are training really hard, like CrossFitters is a good example. We have to remember that exercise is a form of stress. It can be either eustress, which is positive stress, or distress, which is negative stress. And it works through hormesis, which is hormesis refers to a positive adaptation. So let's say you lift a weight and you lift until you can't lift anymore. The way that works is your body, from an evolutionary perspective, thinks, oh, that's a threat or a challenge, so I better rebuild that muscle so that it can meet that challenge next time. So that's a positive adaptation. But it's a stressor. So if you have sufficient metabolic reserve and resilience, you're resourced, you're in a good place, and you exercise hard, that's a positive stress. But if you're burning the candle at both ends, you're a mom with 3 kids and you're working full time and you're not eating well and you're not sleeping well, and then you're going to CrossFit 4 or 5 times a week, you're already at a very high level of stress and your metabolic reserve is already depleted. So that additional stress is going to actually take you in the wrong direction and break you down. And so I see that in women who are not able, a lot of women in that situation aren't able to conceive because, as you said, to start off this interview, the body is basically saying, whoa, hold on, we're really run down and we don't really have the juice, the resources to grow a healthy baby right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, I see this too often, and vegans and vegetarians as well.
Right.
So what do you, I mean, I have no problem and I fully support that. But, when I was reading papers about choline deficiency and B12 deficiency and iron deficiencies, and, during pregnancies, and choline, majority of women are choline deficient, and that's never brought up, ever. And choline is really high in organ meats. So, yeah, it's a lot to look at. So let's, just to wrap this up, what is a unique question that you have found, or something unique that no other real health professional is considering, or person around the realm of pregnancy or preconception?
Really good question. I don't know that I can say that there's something that's nobody else is considering or no one is thinking of.
People.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is what maybe makes my approach a little bit different than most people's approach is the whole evolutionary perspective, is bringing our diet and lifestyle more into alignment with this ancestral template that we know works really well and has worked for thousands and thousands of generations in terms of conceiving. And for me, what that makes possible is a way of generating hypotheses about what might not be right, working well for the patient's diet and lifestyle. So to use a couple examples, we know that, like I said, that humans lived in tribal social groups for the vast majority of our evolutionary history, and then only very recently, and that's still the way it is in the developing world in most places, and it was the way it was in our developed world even up until probably the 1950s. And so if you have a woman who's really feeling socially isolated and doesn't have a lot of support, we might tend to write that off and think it's not very important. But if you're looking through this evolutionary lens, you realize that that's something that could actually be really significant, and then we might focus on that. Physical activity, we would look at it through that similar lens, where we know that humans have not been sitting all day. So it's one thing to go to the gym 3 times a week, but if you're sitting in a chair, either at your office or in the car or at home watching TV for the rest of your week, aside from those 3 hours of gym time, you're still going to be at considerable increased risk of not being able to conceive. Right. And it just goes down the line that way. And so that's given me a kind of framework and a methodology to track all of the possibilities for intervention in the environmental realm, and to make sure that we're just systematically going through those and addressing them. And I've found that to be very effective, both for me as a practitioner and for the patient as a way of staying motivated, and also just being able to track what they're doing and to follow through with it.
Yeah, and I love that you had to really ponder that. And you gave it a shot.
Yeah.
You came back to the fundamentals and your full program, because when I saw you struggle with that, I was doing the same thing. I was like, what's unique with mine as well? And we have to be generalists. We have to be generalists. If we are trying to seek out that magic bullet, and our patients are trying to seek out that magic bullet, it's going to fail.
Yeah.
It's going to fail. So I love that you brought that up.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, Ben. I mean, to be honest, the more I do this work, the more I do come back to the basics.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think we can get a little bit distracted by all of the cool stuff we have access to, all of the, you know, functional medicine testing and analytics. And I think what's happening to me now as a practitioner is, you know, my trajectory has been like just getting really into all of that kind of testing, which I still do with people. But I've had a number of situations in the last year where, you know, I've gone through all of that kind of testing with patients and it hasn't really yielded much. And I say, look, let's put this testing aside and let's maybe, you know, these are often patients who are like reading every blog and attending every summit, and they're overloaded with information. So I ask them to like set that aside for a moment, just like stop taking in so much outside information, set aside the lab testing, you know, let's just like go back to square one and let's look at your life. Let's look at what's going on, and let's look at what the most significant issues are, and just work with those. So as an example, I had a patient who, you know, was doing everything right, had the diet really dialed in and was super focused on that to the extent that she couldn't go out to eat with her friends, couldn't travel, couldn't do anything because she was on such a strict diet. You know, she'd done all of the laboratory testing. She was like constantly tracking everything with trackers and devices. And, you know, her health was like a full-time job. And yet she was pretty unhappy. She didn't have any fun. She wasn't doing anything for play. She, you know, used to be a musician, wasn't playing music anymore. She wasn't spending time with her friends because her diet was so restricted. And I said, you know, with everything you've been through and what if we just do an experiment where your homework is to, you know, make a list of everything that brings you joy and pleasure and that you enjoy doing. And you pick something off of that list every day and you make a commitment to doing one thing from that list every day. And let's just try that. I mean, what do we have to lose? And I saw her a couple months after that, and she was like a different person. You know, she seemed so much healthier than she had been at any point during our work together. And it didn't have anything to do with a lab test or a diet change or anything like that.
No. Yeah. I mean, and how many hundreds and hundreds of patients can you repeat that with? Right? I mean, down the line, I had the exact same situation. I actually presented her case at ShyCon. She had extreme panic attacks. She did her genetic testing through Strategene. She ran her 23andMe report. She goes, does genetic testing really help? Is it really useful? And she showed her genetic results. Yeah, I mean, she was absolutely genetically susceptible to anxiety. I mean, she was slow comp, slow MAO, MTHFR, and she was definitely high risk for panic susceptibility. Yeah. But I worked with her, and within about 25 minutes, I found out her zip code, and in scorecard.org, she lived in the #1 polluted area in the United States for xylene.
Wow.
And she's sucking down xylene, and she had moved out of this city 4 years ago, and her panic attacks reduced. She came back, and they were high again. So scorecard.org, I mean, it's pretty useful, but environmental exposures. And she asked her, like you, when's the last time you took a vacation? 6 years ago.
Whoa. Yeah.
So the basics. I mean, the genes showed susceptibility. She definitely responded and had that issue because other people living in the same zip code probably didn't have panic, but she did. So yeah, fantastic. Well, Chris, anything to leave this, you know, what would you like to leave in their heads to wrap this up with?
Well, I think just continuing on the theme we've been developing is if it always start and for me even continually come back to the basics. And it's really tempting to get drawn into all these fascinating discussions about genetics, MTHFR, and all the other SNPs that can affect our health, or SIBO or all of these things that are very, are real and important and have a real influence. But if the focus is on those things at the expense of the basics, and I think we all know when we do that, I think they can become a distraction and even an impediment to getting well. So the basics are not very glamorous, and I think perhaps culturally or just as part of our human condition, we hope for a kind of magic bullet, some kind of test that's going to reveal some secret, and then some treatment that's going to just with a pill make that go away. But the reality is not, that doesn't match with reality in the vast majority of cases. We need to stick with the mundane but extremely important day-to-day decisions that we make around food and environment and lifestyle. And I think the good news is when you do that, your quality of life improves across the board, not just your health, but your relationships and your experience of the world around you, I think gets better and better.
And the cost goes way down.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge benefit too.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, thank you, Chris, for your insights and taking some time out of your day for this. Much appreciated.
Thank you,
and
Ben.
You have a preconception program still, is Healthy Baby Code still?
Yeah, it's still going awesome. Strong. Get a lot of great feedback on that. And I still think it's, if I look back on my life from a rocking chair, hopefully a long time from now, that's probably the thing I'm still feel like is most important, because there's nothing that's more important than the health of future generations as a parent and just someone who cares about kids and like they, we bring them into the world. They don't have any choice in the matter, and so at least the best we have to do everything we can to make sure that they inherit a healthy world.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'll put the link below for you guys to access that. And Chris, again, thank you, and keep taking those vacations.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben.
All right.